The AYANEO Pocket DMG has got to be one of the strangest handhelds I've used for a very long time. In a lot of ways it's absolutely incredible and an easy recommendation for anyone looking for a vertical Game Boy style device, but on the other hand it's also got so many weird little quirks that it leaves me wondering who this was actually made for. Starting at $419 for the most budget option and going all the way up to $579 for the highest spec version is a hell of a lot of cash to drop on something like this though, and it just leaves me wondering if this steep price tag is actually worth it. So, let's take a look. If you're at all familiar with AYANEO, you'll know that they excel in creating top-of-the-line, beautiful-looking high-spec devices, but that often have the price tag to match. That isn't to say that the products aren't worth the cost though. In fact, I've previously reviewed the AM01 and AM02 mini PC devices, and I absolutely love both of them and think they're actually well worth the cost. So let's give the Pocket DMG a chance here and see what we're looking at. As always with AYANEO, the packaging of the Pocket DMG is amazing. You get this big box with loads of illustrations, loads of foam inserts inside keeping the device and extra accessories safe and snug, simple to follow manuals which explain the layout of the device and what all of its inputs do, a USB-C to USB-C cable for charging and data transfer, and even some of these extra metallic style back bumpers which you can switch out with the default ones to suit your preferences. You even get a spare thumbstick in case you wear the original one down or lose it somehow. I really like it when you get loads of extras like this with these devices because it creates a much more fun unboxing experience and it feels like you're getting more value for your money. There's no denying that the device itself looks absolutely stunning. The whole point of the Pocket DMG project is to pay homage to the original Game Boy while giving us a modern twist on the original design to allow us to play much more demanding games, and they absolutely nailed that philosophy. The version of the device I've got here is the retro colour variant, which actually doesn't seem to be available on the AYANEO store anymore. But to be fair, the Arctic Black and Moon White versions look just as good, even if they don't quite evoke as strong a sense of nostalgia as the retro colour one does. In terms of inputs, we've got some pretty unique stuff happening on almost every side of the device. At first, the front looks fairly standard. We've got an awesome D-pad, which is the classic Nintendo style one, which is by far my personal favourite D-pad design. 4 action buttons, again using the Nintendo layout. A couple of little start and select buttons, and then beneath those we've got the AYA button, which activates the built-in AYA Space software interface, which we'll take a look at later. By far the most interesting element here though is the fact that we've only got a single analog stick, which is positioned in the bottom left corner of the device, with the D-pad taking the primary top left position, which I know a lot of retro enthusiasts will be happy with. There's no second analog stick here though, which at first comes across as a bit weird. Sure, the N64 and Dreamcast only had a single analog stick on their controllers, so it makes sense if the focus was only on emulating up to those systems, and the PS1 had very few games that actually used the right stick. So for the most part it works only having a single stick for that console too. But we've got a device here that's easily capable of emulating PS2 and GameCube content, which standardized having 2 analog sticks. So what's the deal? Well, fear not, because the Pocket DMG actually has a touchpad to the right of the analog stick which can be mapped to mimic right analog stick controls on PS2 and GameCube emulation software. So don't worry, you're not losing out on any camera control here. It does feel a bit weird getting used to this though, and I do find myself wondering what the point of just not having a straightforward right analog stick was. I don't feel like it would have gotten in the way of the other buttons because the left stick is fine and that's directly below the D-pad, so maybe it's just an aesthetic thing? You could also argue that the touchpad in theory gives us additional functionality that wouldn't be provided with a second analog stick, but realistically I can't think of many situations where this would be the case. You could map it to replicate Wiimote pointer controls, or to control a cursor in a light gun game, and it could even theoretically be used to replicate mouse pointer controls in an RTS game, or give you more fine-tuned control in an FPS title. But honestly, all of these things are fairly niche use cases, and I wonder if this is a situation where visual design took precedent over actual practicality. Surely in 99% of situations you'd just be better to have a second stick over a trackpad, right? Or am I just insane? On the left side of the device we've got this LC button, which is set to default to minimize the windows you have open and allow you to quickly close any programs you're not using. However, it can also be remapped to give you an extra button which you could use for save states or something like that. Below that we've got the menu button, which is supposed to bring up the individual emulator software menu to allow you to quickly change settings. However, I actually found that this didn't work by default, and another button on the right of the device did this instead, which is a little bit weird. Then we've got this volume wheel, which is honestly such an awesome touch to bring an element of the original Game Boy back into the design. Plus, you can click it in to quickly mute and unmute the sound, which is a cool little detail. You've then got what's referred to as the turbo switch, which quickly swaps between the different power settings available on the device, so you can adapt to how demanding a game you're playing is on the fly. On the right of the device you've got the RC button, and it's actually this one that I found brings up the emulator menus by default. But again, you can obviously completely customize the button mappings on here, so you can remap this to whatever you want. Then there's the minimize button, which takes you straight back to the Android interface. Then you've also got the power button, which also doubles as a fingerprint reader for if you want to lock the device and keep other people from playing all of your dirty secret video games that you don't want anybody to know about. Finally, there's the micro SD card port, which has this dust cover on it that I found slightly difficult to remove, but I guess at least you know it's not going to be coming loose and flapping around constantly, I suppose. The bottom of the device just has a USB-C port for charging or plugging into a PC to do some of that sweet data transferring, and the top just has a vent to give some airflow. On the back we've got a protruding bottom half which gives your hands a comfortable grip on the device, and we've got these interesting back bumpers which take up the whole width of the console. The way this works is that L1 and R1 are placed at the very edge, which you'll just press normally, but then L2 and R2 are further towards the middle, which you'll need to press with your fingertips. This is potentially another slight issue with the device for me, because I don't find it all that comfortable to use the analog stick and press L2 and R2 at the same time. It just feels like your hand has to be held in a bit of an awkward claw-like fashion, and it would probably cramp up a bit if you were to do this over a long period of time. These back bumpers also present another common issue I've encountered with a number of other retro handhelds, which is that because the back bumpers are all in line, there's no analog triggers, which are a fundamental component of a lot of first-party GameCube titles. So you're not going to be able to move and use FLUDD at the same time in Super Mario Sunshine or Strafe in Metroid Prime, because in order to do those things you'd normally have to half press the back triggers. But with a standard digital bumper you can only either do a full press or no press at all, removing that analog half press functionality. Now, could you potentially do some fancy rebinding to get around this using the other inputs on offer? Probably, but for me it'll never be as playable as just using analog triggers as nature intended. So basically, this thing has a hell of a lot of inputs, and it's also got some interesting little gimmicks that make it pretty unique in the handheld space. I love all of the additional customizable buttons that you can map to quickly access emulator settings, and all of the quirky little things like the volume wheel and the touchpad are really interesting, even if they're not always completely practical. But now, let's take a look under the hood. I've already mentioned that this is easily capable of PS2 and GameCube emulation, but how exactly is that possible? Well, spec-wise, we've got an absolute beast of a device here. This thing has a Qualcomm Snapdragon G3X Gen 2 CPU, an Adreno A32 GPU, 8 to 16 gigs of RAM depending on the exact model of device you buy, with this one I'm testing being the higher spec 16 gig version, and then it has 128 gigs to 1 terabyte of internal storage, again depending on the model you go for. It runs using Android 13 as its OS, it has Bluetooth and Wi-Fi capabilities, and it has an impressive 6000 mAh battery, which is enough to get a couple of hours of gameplay out of intense, demanding games, and around 8 to 10 hours out of less demanding retro games. A particular highlight of this device is the display, which is almost 4 inches in size, has a resolution of 1240 by 1080, given an aspect ratio of 8:7, and it also has touch capabilities to make menu navigation a breeze, and on top of all of this, it's also an OLED screen too. This display is absolutely bonkers, and because of the seriously impressive power being offered by the internals, it will enable upscaling retro games up to the PS2 and GameCube to 1080p while maintaining great performance. Despite the screen being absolutely amazing though, again I do have to question why they gave it an aspect ratio of 8:7 instead of just going for 4:3. Without getting into super nerdy technical information, it's widely accepted that the only mainstream consoles to use an 8:7 aspect ratio, or at least very close to that, are the NES and kind of the SNES. So games on those systems will fill the entire screen and look absolutely insane. Game Boy games have what's close to an 8:7 aspect ratio too, with them being 10:9, so these will also fill the majority of the screen with only tiny black bars on the very left and right, which are hardly even noticeable. However, when we go to the more common 4:3 aspect ratio used by the N64, PS1, Dreamcast, GameCube, PS2, and basically any other console from those eras, this'll mean that we get a letterbox effect with black bars on the top and bottom of the screen to compensate for the display having more vertical pixels than a standard 4:3 display. Now, is this an actual problem with the device? No, not really. It's very easy to just ignore the black bars entirely, and there's still 3.7 inches of the screen that is being used, so it's not even being reduced that much. But it's just a bit of a weird decision to me that they opted for a more unconventional aspect ratio just to fit in with the Game Boy display a bit better, as opposed to being more functional by matching the much more common aspect ratio used by the majority of other devices, and then just having the Game Boy stuff have some black bars on the side which wouldn't have even been that noticeable. I know this all sounds a bit nitpicky, but when you've got a device this powerful, does it really make sense to build it primarily around emulating Game Boy games? To me, not really. But this slightly odd aspect ratio aside, I do want to reiterate that the screen here is absolutely phenomenal. These retro games being upscaled to 1080p on an OLED screen like this literally makes some of them look like they could have been released today, and I wouldn't even question it. So yeah, I think it's safe to say that the screen on offer here is easily one of the standout parts of the entire device. But now let's do a 180 and talk about one of the worst things about the device. It runs using Android as its OS. In a lot of ways, this is actually a good thing. It means that it's more customizable, you can easily install a variety of front ends if you wanted to, and it even gives you the capability to play mobile games, which opens up an entire library of titles to try out. It also means that AYANEO's built-in AYA software works here too. This basically just runs in the background, and by pressing the AYA button on the front of the device, you can bring up a fancy UI which lets you see the frame rate of anything that you're playing, how much of a strain is being put on the CPU and GPU, and you can see all of your different performance modes and loads of other stuff too. There's an attempt at creating a full-on front end here too, which I do appreciate, but I personally found it a little bit awkward to navigate and customize. I had some games stored on my micro SD card, but I couldn't find a way of actually adding them to my library. Now I might just be being stupid and missing something obvious, but there seems to be such a bare bones settings menu here, and I can't find out how to actually do anything. It just automatically detected some of the game ROMs, but then not others, and for me, there's not enough manual control here. As always with these Android-based devices, I just find the easiest and most straightforward way of playing stuff is to just not use a front end at all, and just launch individual emulators through the standard Android interface. It's not the most visually pleasing or sleek way of doing it, but if it's easy and it works, it's what I'm gonna do. Other people might opt to use Emulation Station or Daiji Show to give yourself a more console-like experience, but once you're actually in the game, it doesn't make all that much of a difference. Because it runs with Android, it does also mean that you're going to need to go through every single individual piece of emulation software and configure the video settings, hotkeys, standard input options, and assign cores in RetroArch manually. This is why I always say that if you're brand new to these emulation devices, then typically the Android-based ones aren't going to be the best ones to go for. However, if you're looking at getting the Pocket DMG, it's highly likely that you already know what you're doing, so knock yourself out. But now we've come to the fun part. We've taken a look at the display and all of the inputs on offer, we've customized everything, and we've added all of the games that we want to play, so all that's left to do now is test this sucker out. Let's go. Obviously, any 8 or 16-bit games or anything released before that are gonna run flawlessly here, upscaled to crazy degrees. NES will go up to a 4.5 times upscale, filling most of the screen. The SNES can go to a 4.8 times upscale because its resolution more closely matches the Pocket DMG's resolution. And Game Boy stuff will go up to an absolutely crazy 7.5 times upscale, again taking up most of the entire screen. Sega Mega Drive or Genesis will look letterboxed because of the 4:3 aspect ratio of the original console, but it'll perform flawlessly at a 3.9 times upscale, and even going up to the early 3D systems we can get some insane visuals with PS1 and N64 having a 3.9 times upscale, and Dreamcast being capable of a 1.9 times upscale too. Everything from all of these systems and similarly powered ones will perform perfectly even at the hugely upscaled resolutions. And I think that it's with all of these consoles that you're gonna be the most impressed with the Pocket DMG. Because these consoles only need one analog stick for the vast majorities of the libraries, or don't need an analog stick at all, you're completely covered by the inputs on offer by the Pocket DMG, and aside from it being slightly awkward to reach the L2 and R2 buttons at times, things in general feel pretty much perfect. Even my beloved Ape Escape is playable here thanks to the touchpad being able to replicate right analog stick controls, so I can't really fully deduct any points there either. PS2 and GameCube performance here is absolutely amazing. My go-to thing to complain about is F-Zero GX performance, which from my experience doesn't tend to work very well even on a lot of the more powerful handhelds I've tried. However, if you take the Pocket DMG up to the balance performance mode, it'll run at 60 FPS, even upscaled to 1080p. This is seriously impressive, and it's something that I don't think I've ever personally seen an Android device be able to accomplish before. PS2 is just as impressive, demanding games like Jak and Daxter, which normally stutter in the bigger areas of the game, had no slowdown at all, and this is where the Pocket DMG started to both impress me and make me a little bit frustrated. What we've got here is one of the single most impressive Android handhelds that I've ever used in terms of performance. But it's one which is seemingly designed around playing much less demanding games due to the lack of a right analog stick and the lack of analog triggers. Like, yeah, you can control the camera in Jak and Daxter by using the touchpad and it's fine, but having a right analog stick would have made this perfection. And yeah, in games like F-Zero GX, it's not a total deal breaker to not have the analog triggers, even though it does take away from some of the more fine-tuned strafing you'd normally be able to do. But in a game like Super Mario Sunshine, where one of your main abilities is tied to the analog triggers, the game becomes practically unplayable for me because you don't have access to that. It's just so infuriating that what we've got here is so close to being a literal 10 out of 10 handheld, but there's just these couple of small design choices that massively impact the overall experience that you're gonna have. I did test out some Switch emulation, which actually was surprisingly great, but I won't go into too much detail about that because I don't want Nintendo's gremlins to come knocking on my door. For this console, I would probably recommend changing the performance mode to the game mode, but I would avoid the maximum power setting because it sets the fans to the fastest speed, which makes it sound like it's about to take off and fly through space and time. But on all of the other power modes, it's really quiet, and going to the higher options just affects the battery life because it's drawing more power from the CPU and GPU. so if you're sticking with those lower end retro games, you're probably not even gonna need to change the power setting. The only issue with emulating widescreen content is that because the aspect ratio of that stuff is 16:9, the standard for any modern console, things are gonna look super letterboxed here to a point where I'm not really sure I would recommend this device for any 16:9 content. It's not completely unplayable, but there's a lot of other devices I would pick over this if this is something that you're going to be taking advantage of a lot. The same can also be said for dual screen console emulation too. There's a lot of games on the DS and 3DS which can mostly be played on a single screen, and that'll work just fine here. But if you wanted to play anything which needs both screens to be visible at the same time, I would probably recommend a device with a 16:9 display, so that you can place the screens side by side without losing too much space. So for PSP, Switch, DS and 3DS emulation, I would probably look at getting something like the AYANEO 2 or Retroid Pocket 5 over this. Even though the Pocket DMG is technically capable of running games from those consoles, the screen just makes it a little bit awkward. But after all of this, if we take a step back and look at the Pocket DMG for what it is, everything that it can do, all of its flaws and all of its strengths, is it actually worth the pretty significant price tag? I'm tempted to say yes, just because I genuinely really like this device, and it's easy to overlook its shortcomings based on how great its strengths are. It's an absolute powerhouse capable of running the most demanding PS2 and GameCube titles at full speed, even upscale to 1080p. The device itself looks absolutely gorgeous, potentially one of the single best looking handhelds that I've ever seen, and the display is just as impressive, with the high resolution OLED complementing the power on offer by the internals perfectly. However, for something that costs a minimum of $419 and a maximum of $579, I just can't ignore the few key issues that stop me from calling this a perfect device. The lack of a right analog stick, no analog triggers, kinda weird 8:7 aspect ratio, clunky setting up process, and the fact it doesn't ship with a more sophisticated and customizable front end are all things which are difficult to ignore on a device with such a high price tag, but would be much more forgivable if it was cheaper. To put it into perspective, the Steam Deck 256GB LCD model is $399. That's cheaper than even the cheapest Pocket DMG model, and it's obviously capable of emulating everything that's possible here, with the advantage of it being a full-on Linux PC. That means it's capable of playing Steam games and emulating stuff which isn't currently possible on Android, like Wii U and PS3. Hell, you could even go for the 512GB Steam Deck OLED for $549, which is still cheaper than the most expensive version of the Pocket DMG. Now look, I obviously know that the Steam Deck and the Pocket DMG are entirely different beasts. One is a massive behemoth of a handheld, and the other is a more pocket-friendly Game Boy-like device. But when the price gets to a comparable level to the Steam Deck, I can't help but just think, why would you realistically buy one of these over a Steam Deck? And the only reason I can think of is if you absolutely love the Game Boy form factor and the idea of putting your hands on a horizontal handheld makes you sick. Or I guess if you're literally not going to be playing any games over the PS1, N64 and Dreamcast era, but at that point the Pocket DMG becomes a little bit overkill and there are much cheaper devices that can do that. I mean, I'm just having this constant back and forth battle in my mind as to whether this thing is actually good or not. My dilemma here is that at its core it is really good, and if we just ignore the price completely, then I would say get one, because it's the best vertical handheld emulator that I've ever used. But when we do think about the price, I just think you should get a Steam Deck instead, because it's easier to set up and can do way more than the Pocket DMG will ever be able to. To me, these handheld emulation devices really need to stay out of the $300 plus category, because when we approach that, it's too easy to just write them off because the Steam Deck exists.
But what do you think? Is there a place for these ultra premium handhelds in a post Steam Deck world? And are you interested in picking up a Pocket DMG for yourself? And if so, what will you primarily be using it for? As always, give the video a like if you enjoyed it, subscribe if you want to see my face appearing on your screen again sometime soon, which I know you all do, you creepy little cotton socks. And I've been Rob from Retro Dodo, and I'll see you in the next one.